id, ego and superego.
Id, ego and superego are the three parts of the psychic apparatus defined in Sigmund Freud's structural model of the psyche. They are the three theoretical constructs in terms of whose activity and interaction mental life is described. According to this model of the psyche, the id is the set of uncoordinated instinctual trends. The superego plays the critical and moralizing role. And the ego is the organized, realistic part that mediates between the desires of the id and the superego. The superego can stop you from doing certain things that your id may want you to do. Although the model is structural and makes reference to an apparatus, the id, ego and superego are purely symbolic concepts about the mind and do not correspond to actual somatic structures of the brain, such as the kind dealt with by neuroscience. The concepts themselves arose at a late stage in the development of Freud's thought. The structural model, which succeeded his economic model, and topographical model was first discussed in his 1920 essay Beyond the Pleasure Principle and was formalized and elaborated upon 3 years later in his The Ego and the Id. Freud's proposal was influenced by the ambiguity of the term unconscious, and its many conflicting uses. The id, German, is the unorganized part of the personality structure that contains a human's basic, instinctual drives. It is the only component of personality that is present from birth. It is the source of our bodily needs, wants, desires, and impulses, particularly our sexual and aggressive drives. The id contains the libido, which is the primary source of instinctual force that is unresponsive to the demands of reality. The id acts according to the pleasure principle, the psychic force that motivates the tendency to seek immediate gratification of any impulse, defined as seeking to avoid pain or unpleasure, not displeasure aroused by increases in instinctual tension. If the mind was solely guided by the id, individuals would find it difficult to wait patiently at a restaurant, while feeling hungry, and would most likely grab food from neighboring tables. According to Freud, the id is unconscious by definition. In the id, developmentally, the id precedes the ego. That is, the psychic apparatus begins, at birth, as an undifferentiated id, part of which then develops into a structured ego. Thus, the id. The mind of a newborn child is regarded as completely id-ridden, in the sense that it is a mass of instinctive drives and impulses, and needs immediate satisfaction, a view which equates a newborn child with an id-ridden individual, often humorously, with this analogy, an alimentary tract with no sense of responsibility at either end, paraphrasing a quip made by former U.S. President Ronald Reagan during his 1965 campaign for governor of California, in which he compared government to a baby. The id knows no judgments of value, no good and evil, no morality, instinctual catechsis seeking discharge, that, in our view, is all there is in the id. It is regarded as the great reservoir of libido, the instinctive drive to create, the life instincts that are crucial to pleasurable survival. Alongside of the life instincts came the death instincts, the death drive which Freud articulated relatively late in his career in the hypothesis of a death instinct, the task of which is to lead organic life back into the inanimate state. For Freud, the death instinct would thus seem to express itself, though probably only in part, as an instinct of destruction directed against the external world and other organisms through aggression. Freud considered that the id, the whole person, originally includes all the instinctual impulses, the destructive instinct as well as eros or the life instincts.
Ego.
The ego, German, ich, acts according to the reality principle. That is, it seeks to please the id's drive in realistic ways that will benefit in the long term rather than bring grief. At the same time, Freud concedes that as the ego attempts to mediate between id and reality, it is often obliged to cloak the UX commands of the id with its own PCS rationalizations, to conceal the id's conflicts with reality, to profess to be taking notice of reality even when the id has remained rigid and unyielding. The reality principle that operates the ego is a regulating mechanism that enables the individual to delay gratifying immediate needs and function effectively in the real world. An example would be to resist the urge to grab other people's belongings and buy them instead. The ego is the organized part of the personality structure that includes defensive, perceptual, intellectual, cognitive, and executive functions. Conscious awareness resides in the ego, although not all of the operations of the ego are conscious. Originally, Freud used the word ego to mean a sense of self, but later revised it to mean a set of psychic functions such as judgment, tolerance, reality testing, control, planning, defense, synthesis of information, intellectual functioning, and memory. The ego separates out what is real. It helps us to organize our thoughts and make sense of them and the world around us. The ego is that part of the id which has been modified by the direct influence of the external world. The ego represents what may be called reason and common sense, in contrast to the id, which contains the passions. In its relation to the id, it is like a man on horseback, who has to hold in check the superior strength of the horse. With this difference, that the rider tries to do so with his own strength, while the ego uses borrowed forces. Still worse, it serves three severe masters: the external world, the superego, and the id. Its task is to find a balance between primitive drives and reality while satisfying the id and superego. Its main concern is with the individual's safety and allows some of the id's desires to be expressed, but only when consequences of these actions are marginal. Thus the ego, driven by the id, confined by the superego, repulsed by reality, struggles, bringing about harmony among the forces and influences working in and upon it, and readily breaks out in anxiety, realistic anxiety regarding the external world, moral anxiety regarding the superego, and neurotic anxiety regarding the strength of the passions in the id. It has to do its best to suit all three, thus is constantly feeling harmed by the danger of causing discontent on two other sides. It is said, however, that the ego seems to be more loyal to the id, preferring to gloss over the finer details of reality to minimize conflicts while pretending to have a regard for reality. But the superego is constantly watching every one of the ego's moves and punishes it with feelings of guilt, anxiety, and inferiority. To overcome this, the ego employs defense mechanisms. The defense mechanisms are not done so directly or consciously. They lessen the tension by covering up our impulses that are threatening. Ego defense mechanisms are often used by the ego when its behavior conflicts with reality and either society's morals, norms, and taboos or the individual's expectations as a result of the internalization of these morals, norms, and their taboos. Denial, displacement, intellectualization, fantasy, compensation, projection, rationalization, reaction formation, regression, repression, and sublimation were the defense mechanisms Freud identified. However, his daughter Anna Freud clarified and identified the concepts of undoing, suppression, dissociation, idealization, identification, introjection, inversion, somatization, splitting, and substitution. In a diagram of the structural and topographical models of mind, the ego is depicted to be half in the consciousness, while a quarter is in the preconscious and the other quarter lies in the unconscious. In modern English, ego has many meanings. It could mean one's self-esteem, an inflated sense of self-worth, the conscious thinking self, or in philosophical terms, oneself. Ego development is known as the development of multiple processes, cognitive function, defenses, and interpersonal skills or to early adolescence when ego processes are emerged.
Superego.
The superego, German, Urbrick, reflects the internalization of cultural rules, mainly taught by parents applying their guidance and influence. Freud developed his concept of the superego from an earlier combination of the ego ideal and a special psychical agency which performs the task of seeing that narcissistic satisfaction from the ego ideal is ensured. What we call our conscience. For him, the installation of the superego can be described as a successful instance of identification with the parental agency, while as development proceeds the superego also takes on the influence of those who have stepped into the place of parents, educators, teachers, people chosen as ideal models. The superego aims for perfection. It forms the organized part of the personality structure, mainly but not entirely unconscious, That includes the individual's ego ideals, spiritual goals, and the psychic agency, commonly called conscience, that criticizes and prohibits his or her drives, fantasies, feelings, and actions. The superego can be thought of as a type of conscience that punishes misbehavior with feelings of guilt. For example, for having extramarital affairs. Taken in this sense, the superego is the precedent for the conceptualization of the inner critic as it appears in contemporary therapies such as IFS and voice dialogue. The superego works in contradiction to the id. The superego strives to act in a socially appropriate manner, whereas the id just wants instant self-gratification. The superego controls our sense of right and wrong and guilt. It helps us fit into society by getting us to act in socially acceptable ways. The superego's demands often oppose the id's, so the ego sometimes has a hard time in reconciling the two. Freud's theory implies that the superego is a symbolic internalization of the father figure and cultural regulations. The superego tends to stand in opposition to the desires of the id because of their conflicting objectives, and its aggressiveness towards the ego. The superego acts as the conscience, maintaining our sense of morality and prescription from taboos. The superego and the ego are the product of two key factors, the state of helplessness of the child and the Oedipus complex. Its formation takes place during the dissolution of the Oedipus complex and is formed by an identification with and internalization of the father figure after the little boy cannot successfully hold the mother as a love object out of fear of castration. The concept of superego and the Oedipus complex is subject to criticism for its perceived sexism. Women, who are considered to be already castrated, do not identify with a father, and therefore, for Freud, their superego is never so inexorable, so impersonal, so independent of its emotional origins as we require it to be in men. They are often more influenced in their judgments by feelings of affection or hostility. However, Freud went on to modify his position to the effect that the majority of men are also far behind the masculine ideal and that all human individuals, as a result of their bisexual disposition and of cross-inheritance, combine in themselves both masculine and feminine characteristics. In Sigmund Freud's work Civilization and Its Discontents, 1930, he also discusses the concept of a cultural superego. Freud suggested that the demands of the superego coincide with the precepts of the prevailing cultural superego. At this point the two processes, that of the cultural development of the group and that of the cultural development of the individual, are, as it were, always interlocked. Ethics are a central element in the demands of the cultural superego, but Freud, as analytic moralist, protested against what he called the unpsychological proceedings of the cultural superego. The ethical demands of the cultural superego. It does not trouble itself enough about the facts of the mental constitution of human beings.
Advantages of the structural model.
Freud's earlier, topographical model of the mind had divided the mind into the three elements of conscious, pre-conscious, and unconscious. The conscious contains events that we are aware of, pre-conscious is events that are in the process of becoming conscious, and unconscious include events that we are not aware of. At its heart was the dialectic of unconscious traumatic memory versus consciousness, which soon became a conflict between system UX versus system CS. With what Freud called the disagreeable discovery that on the one hand, superego and conscious and on the other hand repressed and unconscious are far from coinciding, Freud took the step in the structural model to no longer use the term unconscious in the systematic sense, and to rename the mental region that is foreign to the ego. In future call it the id. The partition of the psyche defined in the structural model is thus one that cuts across the topographical model's partition of conscious versus unconscious. The new terminology which he introduced has a highly clarifying effect and so made further clinical advances possible. Its value lies in the increased degree of precision and diversification made possible. Although the id is unconscious by definition, the ego and the superego are both partly conscious and partly unconscious. What is more, with this new model Freud achieved a more systematic classification of mental disorder than had been available previously. It is important to realize however, that the three newly presented entities, the id, the ego and the superego, All had lengthy past histories, two of them under other names, the id as the systematic unconscious, the superego as conscience ego ideal. Equally, Freud never abandoned the topographical division of conscious, preconscious, and unconscious, though as he noted ruefully the three qualities of consciousness and the three provinces of the mental apparatus do not fall together into three peaceful couples. We had no right to expect any such smooth arrangement. The iceberg metaphor is a commonly used visual when attempting to relate the ego, id and superego with a conscious and unconscious mind. In the iceberg metaphor, the entire id and part of both the superego and the ego would be submerged in the underwater portion representing the unconscious mind. The remaining portions of the ego and superego would be displayed above water in the conscious mind area.
Translation.
The terms id, ego, and superego are not Freud's own. They are Latinizations by his translator James Strachey. Freud himself wrote of das Is, das Ich, and das Überich, respectively, the it, the I, and the over I, or I above. Thus to the German reader, Freud's original terms are more or less self-explanatory. Freud borrowed the term das Is from Georg Grodeck, a German physician to whose unconventional ideas Freud was much attracted. Grodeck's translators render the term in English as the it. The word ego is taken directly from Latin, where it is the nominative of the first-person singular personal pronoun and is translated as I myself to express emphasis. Figures like Bruno Bettelheim have criticized the way the English translations impeded students' efforts to gain a true understanding of Freud. By substituting the formalized language of the elaborated code for the quotidian immediacy of Freud's own language,